There was a man who went to work every morning and before daybreak, left, came home after dark every night by the same route. And as time went on, he saw some piles of dirt out in the field. And as time progressed, each day something new would be there. There would be basement walls, a floor, walls, trusses, roof, shingles, siding. And eventually he said to his wife, "You know, I've seen a house grow right out of the ground." And she laughed at him, of course, because it's ridiculous. But he said, "I never saw anybody building out there. All I ever saw was the house, and it seemed to grow." And that, in a nutshell, is materialism. It begins with the idea that everything that we see, everything we experience, the physical and phenomenal and energetic world is all that there is, and that there is no deity, there is no metaphysical reality of any kind. And that puts it on shaky ground right away, because you cannot prove a negative. You can't prove that something doesn't exist. You can only find out that it does. So it begins with a presupposition that is not provable. And they like to use science. They love science, but they love it for the wrong reasons. There are several scientific principles that point to the opposite of that idea. And I'll give you 3 examples of them. One is the law of biogenesis. And what the law of biogenesis states is that life only comes from other living things, experimentally proved by Louis Pasteur in the 19th century. And certainly there's been no observed contradictions to that idea. What the natural consequence of that idea is, or a natural question that should arise, is, well, then how did life get here? Well, by that principle alone, you would think that something living had to create it. Well, then you would come to another step. Well, where did that being come from? And to get yourself out of an infinite regression, you would have to assume that it would be an eternal being that would be able to do such a thing. The second and third, will actually start with the second law of thermodynamics, states that all things decay. That's the long and the short of it. And what that basically leads to is the fact that the universe had to have a beginning, because all things decay, all things break down into their constituent parts, that it had to have a beginning. And very few people even object to that idea anymore. There was a time in the 20th century, even through the mid-20th century, where there was something called the steady state universe, that it was eternal. Hinduism likes that idea quite a bit because it states that the universe is eternal. But it's in opposition to the second law of thermodynamics. So if the universe had to have a beginning, the natural question becomes, well, how did it get here? That leads us to the first law of thermodynamics, which says that energy and matter can neither be created nor destroyed. And what that means is you can't from nothing make something. One joke that kind of illustrates that idea is a scientist says to a guy, to God, I think I can create life from dirt, just the way you said you did it. And he says, okay. God says, go ahead, do that. And he starts to scoop up some dirt, and God says to him, oh no, you have to get your own dirt. See, we can't even make dirt from nothing. It's very important to understand that not only does the universe have to have a beginning, but it can't come into being from nothing, which is what basically we have to accept if we're a materialist. That's what led to things like string theory, is the fact that they're still looking for how we got all the matter that we have. And there are several examples, problems with things like the Big Bang that aren't widely known, aren't widely talked about. Where the real problem is because materialists really make up a small portion of the planet in terms of percentage of the population, but they exert an incredible amount of influence. It is the de facto worldview that's taught in public schools in America, for example, and in higher education. We're not even allowed to talk about things like worldviews without it becoming a religious test of some kind. But understand this, it is a belief system just like any other belief system, only except with less credibility to it. But it's taught as if it's fact, and that's really where the problem comes in. We're not even really allowed to examine it at its root. and that's a problem. Because it leads to all kinds of different problems. A lot of things that happen, one of probably the most unreported thing about the 20th century, it's not like it's hidden, but it kind of is hidden, is the way that materialism played out in the 20th century. It is the de facto worldview of any communist state that existed there. And what that ended up leading to is a lot of atrocities, because they base their worldview on the idea that it's survival of the fittest, so the most powerful, the strongest get to continue forward, and any subjugation of the weak is just part of the deal. If they're eliminated, it's good. As one movie puts it, wicked is good. They bought into that. You know, nature is red in tooth and claw. And because of that, it justified any amount of atrocities that they wanted to carry out. In the Soviet Union, in China, Nazi Germany, all of them bought into that idea. And because of that, it led to a lot of deaths all around the world. What ended up being basically covered up now, you hear about the Holocaust of the Jews, but you don't really hear too much about the Holocaust of the Christian church under those communist regimes. Guys like Stalin, Mao Zedong, Pol Pot really put a severe hurt on the church in those countries. And it still exists in great part to this day. There are certain places where Christianity cannot be taught. Now, what's funny about materialism, though, is the Stalins of the world, the Lenins of the world, they were okay with Islam, but not Christianity and Judaism. And we'll discuss that and why of that in a future video. But understand this, that materialism, even though it's taught as fact, is really on shifting sand. The presupposition is itself unprovable. In many cases, if you familiarize yourself with various scientific principles, you'll find out that it can't really stand up to scrutiny as being a legitimate worldview, but it is taught that way. Now, what I hope to do from this is show you that you're being taught this. A lot of people think they begin thinking when they reject the idea of God. All right? Really, you've been told to reject the idea of God, and you've accepted it, and you've stopped thinking about it. You've stopped really examining what the nature of truth is anymore, because you've been told by a guy in a white coat, or a gal, that there is no deity, and that only thinking people accept the idea that there is none. Well, there is one. All right, and nothing, if you start with it a priori, and I'll show you a quote from one materialist that pretty succinctly describes how they feel about this. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, and in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is an absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. That quote was from Richard Lewontin in an interview that he did with New York Review back in 1997. And it somewhat encapsulates the problems with materialism. They have many unsubstantiated stories, meaning there's no corroborating evidence for what they're proposing. It flies in the face of many scientific principles, and also that it doesn't even take into account historical narrative or historical record that may contradict their ideas. So that's the long and the short of materialism and its many fallacies. Understand that it's not as supported as people would have you to think, and that if you dig a little deeper, and it doesn't take very long, especially with the internet these days, to find out just just how shallow the information there really is. So if you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email at my email address below. And thank you for viewing this video. Have a great day.